Hey everybody, it's Nick. I got a tutorial for you today that is basically a supplemental to some of the other tutorials I have about non-photorealistic rendering. This is when you're trying to make something that's like very stylized. You're not trying to make it look real, or at least not trying to approximate like reality. And to do that, we do a lot of things with like like adding line work and rendering parts of the image so that we can apply texture and color in a tool like Photoshop. And I just want to show you some other output options. The other video I have go through some of the simple kind of color and procedural texture options with just basic like Rhino. There's a couple things you can do with V-Ray that are kind of interesting, so I'm going to go ahead and add that. So right now I've got our demo model. Some really interesting stuff you can do just very quickly out of the box if you need it is you can go into the rendered view or go into one of these like pen views, this Arctic view, which is kind of it's sort of like ambient occlusion, and you can actually get this image out and use that as a basis to start working. And you got to keep a couple things in mind. One thing I noticed is that actually in some of these views it's actually clipping through the view. That's just because I have a very very large ground plane like object. If I get rid of that, it's actually gonna let the camera view all the way through this model. You can go ahead and put that horizon line back in another image, but that's if you don't change that, that's gonna prevent you from getting the full view. So, for example, and the most important thing with all these techniques is that you have a camera. You have to have the same camera and render everything at the same resolution. That way, when you go into Photoshop, everything's gonna pop in really clean. And just to give you a sense of what I'm even talking about in the first place, like this is the image that I have, just of the building out of stock like V-Ray. And what I've got is I've got a bunch of layers and different things. And so like if I could get the lines out of Make 2D, for example, to give that some line work, I could take those lines and add the Arctic view to them, for example. Other things I can do to the base drawing is I can actually adjust it with some of the layers that I get out of V-Ray. So if I just render the shadows as an image, for example, I can darken or lighten parts of the shadows in the image, or I could take the shadows and I could use a like filter to create like an artistic display for that filter. I could add some noise to it, or I could give it some other kind of quality to it. So there's different things I could do once I have that information like separated. You know, um, and you can do things that control the light, things that control the shadow. Some of them are more subtle than others. And I can layer those on, and that way it makes it easier for me to get the kind of image I want and the quality of image I want, especially if it's non-photorealistic. This is a technique that a lot of renderers use anyway. It's a tool. It's called like render elements, and if you look at render elements, like you can basically take an image and separate it into all of its different components, and that allows you a lot of control after you've rendered it. And that's can be a really good strategy because that way, if you want to change something, you don't have to go back through and render the whole image over again. You can do a lot of the image editing just in Photoshop. And as I said, before, Photoshop is the most powerful rendering tool that you have. So there's all these different types of things that you can get, and this is V-Ray, and these are supported by the Render Elements rollout. But a lot of other rendering programs like Studio Max and some other ones will also support render elements. So that's something you can think about. Like this is a real like professional like level thing. A lot of times we just render and it's good enough it comes out of the computer. But if you really want to do a lot of editing with it, a lot of noodling, it's good to have all these different like background elements that you can actually play with. So that's where this is going. I just want to talk about how you get some of these things out. So go back to Rhino. One thing you can do, to get something like this out, so you can work on it. The Rhino renderer these days is pretty good. Like these the kind of real time like shadowing and stuff has kind of a nice atmospheric effect, and for a lot of applications it's good enough, especially if you're in the middle of a design, you just want to get something out, you don't care about final quality. Maybe it's an aesthetic that you like, so you can go ahead and change your like your view type You could do different things with it too. Like if you want to, you can actually go in and say display options, and that'll actually let you edit these things. So for example, if you, I will often use a white background color, but that's not the default. So you could change the background color if you need to. When you make a change, it usually turns purple. I guess it did, but if you need to go back, you can just say restore defaults. I'm gonna go back to white though. You can do all kinds of things. Like any of these types can actually be edited. You can add shadows or turn the shadows off. You can affect the way that curves are represented. You can change the like pixel width of the lines. You can do all kinds of stuff. So that's really cool. And once you get things set up the way you want to, I gotta go back and fix this now. You can go in, and you don't have to render anything. And this is the idea. You're not rendering. You're using what's captured in the viewport. And you go into View, you go to Capture, and you say to File, and you get this nice dialog that comes up. And you can actually go in. You can say Custom Resolution. I'm going to render all my stuff at 1600 by 900. That's a widescreen ratio. It's pretty good, especially if you need something quick. So that's one I use a lot when I'm doing drafts. And so you can change that ratio here, but I'm going to go custom, and then I type in 1600 by 900, and then you click OK, and then that's it. You're going to get this file is going to actually output that image for you, and you'll get it as a JPEG or as a TIFF or a PNG or whatever. So that's really handy. You can also do that with, like, let's say the pen layer. This is a quick way to get lines out. What I don't like about it is that they're not vector lines; they're the bitmap, and they're pretty smooth, but they may not be what you need. You're also depending on Rhino to represent silhouettes, creases, and folds. If you use vectors in V-Ray, if you use vectors in Illustrator, you can control all that. You can control the line weight, and you can control it after the fact. If you do this, basically you're left with whatever Rhino gives you. Again, you can go into display options. You can change things like if you wanted to change the sizes of things, you absolutely could. You can make these bigger or make them smaller if you want to. What I'm going to do, what I always do, is I'm going to go back and I'm going to turn the background off because I don't like that fake paper background, and I'm just going to get lines. So I can go in and I can say View, Capture to File, and what that looks like in practice is something that's more like this. And that's not bad. Like, it's certainly not a lot of work. But if you have Make 2D, you can adjust things more. I have not really done that with this Make 2D, but you can see they're roughly equivalent at this point. But eventually, the Make 2D is going to give you a lot more control, but at the expense of some more work. So you got that going on. That's pretty good. And if you do the rendered view, you can get some pretty basic shadows and textures. If you go to display options here, you can make that look better. If you go into the shadows option, you can increase the amount of memory you use depending on your graphics card. And see, that'll make the shadows look nicer. If you want them fuzzy, you can do that if it's an aesthetic thing. But you can certainly adjust these parameters to make the shadows look the way you want. And you can see they turn purple. That means you've made a change. And then go ahead and export that out. So that can also be a nice kind of base layer. But that goes with the other video that I have where you're using Photoshop brushes and textures and filters and that kind of stuff. But this gives you a nice kind of base layer similar to what the students had in that video. And this is kind of a nice way to do it. So you can do that. The second thing I'm going to do is just, if you want to do Make 2D, you Make 2D. We're going to select everything. We've already gone through this before. I'm just going to do the group output and go OK. And it's pretty quick. Go to top view. And I'm going to go ahead and export that. So if I export this as an Adobe Illustrator file, I can go ahead and I can open it up in Illustrator and get my lines out of it. Let me take you through that process again really quick though, just to make sure, because the trick with this is that you need to get the size right, or as much as you can. So I'm going to open up my Make 2D that I had, and this is what I got, and I'm going to go ahead and just basically make it all black lines. And see, it's pretty thick, so I might need to go ahead and edit the stroke weight. I could actually go in if I wanted to in a different if I had a different file, if I had this stuff sorted out, where I could do the silhouettes of things, or I could do different weights for different materials. You have a lot of control over it. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna edit the artboard, and let's see, I need to make my units. Units are in pixels, and then I go to artboard, and I'm gonna go to 1600 by 900. And see, I was way smaller than I was, so I'm going to zoom out. Oops, do that again. I'm using a Mac, so when I use the Windows keyboard, it confuses me sometimes. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put this in a corner. And I'm going to go ahead and, oops, I'm going to hold Shift to stretch it. Now, because of the way that I made this file, this is actually 1600 by 900, but there's nothing up here. And so when I do the bounding box, like it might look like it's smaller, but it's actually in the right aspect ratio. Okay, once I've got that, you can go ahead and save it. I go ahead and I would just save it as an Adobe Illustrator file, and until you open it up in Photoshop, and then you're gonna rasterize it. So we're gonna open it up. This is my Make 2D that I just edited for scale. And you could do a couple different things here. You could just go ahead and type in 1600. Now remember that height's not going to quite be right, and that's fine. If that works for you, if you wanted more information on the file, you could actually double the size of it. So you go 3200, and then you could scale it by half once you put it in the drawing. That also can work. But basically, you're just going to keep the proportions constrained. The width is the thing that matters in this case for this drawing. So long as you hit that mark, you should be fine. I'm going to check my other drawing really quickly here, just make sure. Yeah, so this is not a huge image. Let's check the image size again. Yeah, this is 72 pixels per inch. That's fine for working on the computer. If you're going to view it on the computer, if you want to bump that up, just make sure that you translate it to the file when you're opening up the Illustrator file in Photoshop. The other thing I gotta check with stuff out of VRay, just make sure that your mode is RGB, and I would use 16 bits per channel. Should be set to that by default, but make sure. If you have 32-bit, sometimes some of the layer types don't quite work right, like you don't have access to them. You want to make sure to check that. Okay, that was a little detour. Okay, so I'm gonna open it up and get it in here. So I'm gonna go to my Make 2D. And I'm going to go 1600. And what you want to try to do, okay, and then I'm going to select everything. Oops, do that again. Select everything. Copy. Paste. Yeah, if you do it right, the idea is it should basically just pop in to your drawing without too much editing. And I'm kind of nudging it with the keyboard right now to get it to line up. Yeah, something didn't quite. If it's not quite right, go ahead and transform it. So I'm just going to stretch it to fit. And you can get it reasonably close. Not quite sure why it didn't exactly, but you can make it work. But you want to try to do, oops, I did mess that up. You want to try to do as little of this kind of stuff as possible, just because, I did it again. Hang on. Okay. Wait. I'm going to go to layer 1. Keeps jumping to that thing. We'll lock. Let's see here. Yeah, lock it. Keeps wanting to move everything. I don't know why it's doing this right now, but I'll go ahead and make sure that I'm pixel layer. Yeah. There we go. Now it's working. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm just moving it with my arrow keys. It's still off a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and transform it. Just make sure that you scale it uniformly. Do not, if you if you accidentally, start scaling it in just the X or the Y, it's going to distort it. It's not going to line up. And now it's too big. So I'm going to fix this a little bit. It's good to try to find things in the image, like corners and stuff to line up to. Yeah, that's pretty good. So yeah, if you just have to nudge it a little bit. Hang on a second here. That's better. Okay, so it's kind of a little process, but that's going to get you those lines in the drawing as a layer, and that's what I have. So, um, okay, so we did that. Last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into. I'm going to go ahead and unlock these for now. I'm going to go into V-Ray and look at those render elements. So I'm going to go back to my view. Remember, always being the same view. So it looks like I'm in V-Ray, so that's good. And then I'm going to go up to V-Ray, go up to Asset Editor. To add render elements, you just right-click on this, and you can just go in and say, okay, I want the lighting, I want the diffuse, which is color. You might say I want shadows, or I want matte shadows, or raw shadows. So you can look at what some of these options are. Some of them are useful, and some of them aren't. One thing that's really useful sometimes is the material ID and object ID. So if you give things different material ID numbers, like when you're texturing things, it'll actually output an image that outputs each material as a color, and that makes it really easy to like select objects later. There's all kinds of stuff you can do with this. You can actually click on these too. You can get a better sense of what that looks like. Okay, so we're going into Rhinoceros, and let's see, diffuse. I don't know. Let's take a look at maybe a fun lighting analysis. So you get these render elements. You go into your rendering. You need to be in the regular rendering, not interactive. You're gonna go to your output, and in this case, again, I did 1600 by 900. You have to have save image turned on, and you have to put your images somewhere. I'm gonna make them into TIFFs. TIFF is a good idea. I'm gonna go to 32-bit because it doesn't have any like compression, or has a lot less compression than pings, PNGs and like JPEGs. It's always good to have a high resolution version, and then you can edit it later. You can always compress it later, but if you start with a compressed image, it's you've already lost some information. So everything looks good. I already set up the lights and everything the way I wanted to, so I'm just going to go ahead and render it. And it's going to take a little bit, but when it renders the image, it will actually render everything. So it's actually rendering all of the different render elements at the same time that it renders the kind of beauty image, and that's really handy. So we're gonna let it crunch for a minute, and when it's done, I'll show you what the images are. So here's the first pass, and now here's the sample pass. And 1600 by 900 renders pretty quickly on a 2019 MacBook Pro. It's a pretty good file size. Just enough detail. All right, so there's that. And then if I go to my desktop where I put my files, you should be able to see. Yeah, that's kind of fun. So there's the lighting analysis file. So they're all separated out, and they're just TIFF files. And then you can go in, and so that's where I got all these layers from. And so again, once you have them, you can do things like the shadows one's interesting because you actually have to invert it. Like it starts off. I've already kind of adjusted it here. It starts off actually like this. And one way you can use it, I like to do, is just go in and invert it again. And then if you've got your drawing, one thing you could do if you wanted to is you can put it on a multiply layer and you can adjust the opacity. And it's a way, if you want to make certain shadows pop, that's one way that you can do that. You could also, take a drawing and then you get like a really flat, almost like SketchUp. I mean, this is this is really close to SketchUp. It gives you that kind of view. So there's all kinds of ways you can. The more kind of layers you have, the more things you can kind of play with to create the kind of effect that you want. So anyway, so there's lots of different options for things. Oh, I can't believe I made SketchUp. Anyway, so there's some things, and it's a good way to start using the methods from the other video so that you can create some really cool non-photorealistic drawings. Okay, hope that was helpful. I will see you in class. Thanks.